Welcome to a special edition of Live and Local. The topic of tonight's show is Iowa Cityans Look Back at the Caucus. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special thanks to the show UN Report, which is usually on at this time, and gave up their time so that we could broadcast this special show. All right, we have on 5 people from Iowa City who each supported a different candidate in the caucus. To my immediate right, Larry Baker, who was a Dean supporter, Michael Flaum, a Kerry supporter, Tom Carsner, an Edwards supporter, Sue Dvorsky, a Gephardt supporter, and Shel Stromquist, a Kucinich supporter. Okay, let's get right into it. I think we could all agree it was an incredible finish to a long caucus campaign. And obviously the big stories are the ascendance of Kerry and Edwards and the descent of Dean, since Dean had been leading for so long in this race. Well, let's go first to our Dean supporter, Larry Baker. Larry, what happened?
Well, I think the combination of a lot of misgivings that everyone had about all the various candidates trying to find who they think is the most electable. When we got right down to making a choice, they made a decision that, in their view, Dean was probably not the person they were most comfortable with as being electable. Because I think the important story of this whole caucus is the total turnout, which should be a sign to the Republican Party that the Democratic Party is prepared to do something that it didn't do last 4 years ago, which is turn out in droves and turn Bush out. I was surprised by the gap between first and third, first and second, but I wasn't necessarily surprised by the results, even though I thought Dean still had a chance there at the end. But I think, you know, the combination of all the sort of negative advertising and just a lot of Dean's own problems led to this particular conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Michael, since you were a Kerry supporter and you came out on top, and you told me that a month ago at least that he was going to win, and I didn't believe you. What do you think about what happened?
I don't think I believed it either a month ago. But I don't know. I mean, obviously I'm pleased. Although I must say, I think the real story of the night, I shouldn't say this as a Kerry supporter, but I think the real story of the night was John Edwards. And I think in terms of bounce, he's the one who got the biggest bounce. You know, in terms of what happened, people are saying that this turnout of 120 some odd thousand is not greater than in 1988. I wasn't here for the 88 caucuses, but it's hard for me to imagine that there's ever been a turnout anywhere near what we had. Every precinct that I talked to, you know, everybody ran out of forms, and it was, I mean, we had 207 people at my little precinct for 4 lousy delegates. And I wonder if this, you know, everybody who said it's not about the polls, it's about the organization, maybe they're just dead wrong. Maybe it is about the polls. Maybe a caucus like this is not a caucus where you just get the activists and it really matters how much labor is there and how much, you know, maybe this really just was sort of a primary. And the turnout was so huge that maybe it's not surprising. And maybe polling has gotten sophisticated enough that they were able to make a good call.
Well, I was shocked. The Sunday Register, the day before the caucuses, had it exactly right. Yeah. And I frankly didn't believe it. They had Kerry, Edwards, Dean, Gephardt.
So did Zogby in that same order. Right. So they had the right numbers. Yeah. They were talking to the right people.
And I thought they were under counting Dean, because so many of his folks, I thought, had cell phones and weren't being counted. But the polling was extremely accurate. Larry, let me ask you again, were you expecting more? We'll get
expecting more turnout for Dean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were waiting until the very last minute and sensing a trend that was going against Dean. That helped make up their minds to switch to somebody else.
Was it the attacks?
Oh, sure. I mean, that's not the only reason. I was thinking about this the other day, and it dawned on me that in television, Howard Dean is the perfect internet candidate. He got out early with issues. He got out early with dissatisfaction with the establishment and the Democratic establishment and the Bush establishment. And he, in my mind, was the first person really expressing that sort of discontent. At least he represented that discontent. And then the more television got involved and the coverage got involved, the more his image was shaped by other factors. And it became a case of not necessarily the substance of what he believed in, but the style in which he presented that substance. And that was counterproductive to him.
Okay, Tom, since our Kerry supporter here has even acknowledged that the big story was Edwards coming in second, how did he do it?
It took a long, long time before I think the media and the story cycles were free enough to let Edwards' message come out. For months, every day the newspapers had stories about Dean and Gephardt, and maybe some about Kerry, maybe another one about Kucinich, and maybe one about Edwards once a week. And that went on for months and months and months until the first of the year, when I think, as Larry said, some of Dean's shortcomings caught up with him, and things seemed to open up and more attention was paid to more candidates. And Edwards' message began to get out. In December, I had traveled, I took 2 days and traveled along with the Edwards campaign into southern Iowa just to see what it was like in places beyond Iowa City. And he was, getting crowds of 100 and 200, and in a VFW hall in Ottumwa at 8:30 at night, 300 people. But, you would never know that from what was in the daily newspaper.
Yeah, he was certainly under the radar screen.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And the talk about attendance, people were paying attention after all. I mean, I knocked on doors and called people, and in the end, it really did have an effect. And I think people responded well to Edwards, not getting into the fray, but also really
being a positive candidate.
Well, if you want to call it that, sure. And talking about economic issues primarily, and really zeroing in on that, and that's what people are paying attention to.
Yeah, when I said, not getting into the fray, I mean, he didn't run negative ads.
Right.
His literature wasn't negative, didn't attack anybody. And then this thing that came out at the end, that he was one of us on economic issues, the whole son of the mill worker, that he really felt deeply about the common person, I think started to resonate at the end.
Well, I think people respect him for his family roots, and he did it. He did it himself. He went, he earned every penny he's got, and I admit he does have a few pennies. But so do other candidates around the room here as well.
Not all the other candidates.
That's true. That's true. But I think people respect that, and they see a seamless quality to many of the proposals that he has economically, and that he earned it honestly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, our Gephardt supporter, Sue Dvorsky.
Well, I'm sorry, dear.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that in the same gracious spirit that Congressman Gephardt spoke, and all the other candidates last night about Dick Gephardt, I'd like to start off by saying that I think that Gordon Fisher, Gene Hesberg, Ben Fekke, the director of the Caucus effort for the IDP, the Iowa Democratic Party, did a fabulous job.
Now, who are those first two people?
Those are the executive director and the director of the Iowa Democratic Party. This was a wonderful, wonderful night to be a Democrat. It was a wonderful night to be in Iowa. And Chris Matthews, who's not particularly given to, smudgy feeling statements, at the end at 11 o'clock last night said that when we're trying to build a democracy, or at least nominally trying to build a democracy in other countries, this really was a tremendous example. It was a wonderful thing to be a part of. And I'd like to also recognize, and I think all of us do, that the staffs, the young people, they're all young people, because they have to be. They would drop dead of exhaustion and they can't make any money, so they're all young people. the staff people for all of these candidates, all of them, not just the 5 of us, but all the other candidates, young and excited and enthusiastic about their country, about the process. It's absolutely gratifying and heartwarming about the state of the American body politic. I think it was a tremendous night. Having said that, you know, Dick Gephardt, I will always be proud to stand up and say, in years hence, as we now say, you know, who'd you stand for in '88? Either we hang with a particularly bizarre group of people or this is just of interest. I'll always be proud to say that we stood for Dick Gephardt. Dick Gephardt is a man of such integrity, such hard work. I do and did believe that he was the right temperament, the right record, the right experience to hit the ground running in January 2005.
Was he simply, as many of the pundits have said, just an old face?
I think so. And I think that the people that he represents best are simply a waning force in democratic politics because they're a waning force in American
You're
politics.
talking about labor unions?
Yeah, and
trade
manufacturing,
unions.
the manufacturing labor
Yeah,
unions.
the trade especially, yeah.
And we as a group in Coralville won, and I suspect across the state, and I know in many other precincts in Iowa City, in Johnson County, went to Edwards, feeling that this was maybe the new face of that kind of labor movement, of somebody who's got that kind of experience in a state similar, the textile industries, those kinds of industries, where those kinds of stories will resonate. And so that's what we did. But I just have nothing but admiration for Gephardt, his campaign, and I will say too the way he ran it, because I do think that it's more than style. It's more than issues, and it is style. That is an issue. If you're going to be in people's houses for the next year, and hopefully for the next 4, they simply have to have a comfort level. And I do think that there was a benefit. This is what a caucus, this is what the whole primary system is about, testing that out, seeing how comfortable you are, what your strategies are for dealing with that.
Larry, do you think Gephardt and Kerry attacked Dean unfairly?
I think every politician, this is a generic statement, part of your job is to define the opponent and look for weak spots, what you consider weak spots. If your weak spot is style, you define that way. I'm more concerned about Joe Lieberman than I am with Richard Gephardt and John Kerry's performance as far as helping shape other people's perception of Howard Dean. And, you know, he's been described before, Lieberman, as sort of the Democratic Party version of a dead man walking. He's just going to disappear after New Hampshire. And
Yeah.
haven't quite figured out what the role was here in Iowa.
Yeah. Well,
He's going to be in
let's get to Dennis Kucinich, who I believe received 1% of the delegates.
7.3 in Johnson County.
Yes, 7.3 in Johnson County. I have that down. Shel Stromquist, where does Dennis go from here, and to what do you attribute his very meager showing, considering he campaigned very vigorously all over the state?
Well, let me first say that I agree with several of my colleagues here that the story of the night was the incredible turnout of Democrats, particularly young Democrats, all of whom are committed to getting George Bush out of the White House. And I think, there was a lot of contention during the campaign. There were a lot of, to my mind, unfortunate things said by candidates about other candidates. But it did seem to me that when Iowans finally caucused on Monday night, certainly in my caucus and what I've heard other places, there was a degree of unity despite differences in preferences that was really palpable. And I'm in a precinct that's very heavily student populated. 240 people, overwhelmingly attended by people who had never registered before and who came with a kind of freshness and a kind of enthusiasm that this party so badly needs. And I think, frankly, that Dennis and Howard Dean and John Edwards are partly responsible for getting those people there. And I think Dennis's message has been a very important one to have in this campaign and to continue to have in the campaign. It seems to me that he's been willing to speak with a kind of forthrightness and directness about the issues, to take positions that are in advance of other candidates that are important to have in this debate about how we are going to get out of Iraq now, rather than at some vague time in the future, rather than a kind of reflection of George Bush's policy about bringing democracy to Iraq. How are we going to do it now? Has been important for that to be said in the campaign, and for Dennis to have outlined a concrete campaign, to talk about national single-payer health insurance, to go farther on that issue than some of the other candidates were prepared to do, to talk about cutting the defense budget in a very substantial way in order to fund the domestic programs that are now being squeezed dry by the Bush administration. So, I mean, I think Dennis's numbers aren't great. I'm sure he's disappointed. He did put a lot of energy into Iowa, but I think that he helped to generate a kind of enthusiasm, a kind of renewal in the party that's evident here in Iowa, and I think it's going to be evident in every state from here on out. So I'm excited about the results, and I'm excited for him. You know, he's a real fighter. He fought the big utilities and the banks in Cleveland when he was the boy mayor, and he was elected against all odds in a heavily Republican district to Congress, and he's been reelected and reelected and reelected. He's shown a capacity to reach out beyond the tried and true constituency, and I think that's what this party badly needs, is that kind of energy and that kind of vision.
Is he going to go on?
I have no inside information, but my guess would be that he's going to. His is not a campaign that depends heavily on big bucks, right? It depends on a lot of grassroots support. It's more like a social movement than it is a political campaign in the traditional sense.
It's not an ego trip.
I don't think it's an ego trip. I mean, every politician who's in at this level is in it partly because of ego. But I think he's in it to get these issues in the debate and to keep them in the debate. And my guess would be that with whatever money he's able to raise, that he's going to stay in as long as he can.
Well, you mentioned getting out of Iraq with Kerry and Edwards, the top two who both supported the war. Where do we go? Is the war just going to be a non-issue? Michael Flaum from the Kerry group?
Well, one person that I've admired for a long time is Barney Frank, who, as most of you know, first openly gay person in Congress. And I really liked what Barney Frank had to say when he was stumping for Kerry, and he came right out. He just said, I was disappointed that Kerry supported the war. But those were odd times. A lot of good people that I respect and did the same thing. And I think that that is not the whole set of issues here. And I think that may have been one of the weaknesses of the Dean campaign, that people recognize that all of these issues are tremendously complex. And I think that it probably took Kerry a while to kind of figure out what his position on Iraq was and is going to be. And it's not going to sit terribly well with some people. But the question is, how do you measure a candidate in the whole?
Well, a question for Larry and Shell, since your candidates were against the war, are you going to be able to swallow Kerry or Edwards?
The split in the party that pundits are making about the anti-war Democrats versus the ones that voted for the war, that's a non-issue. There's only one anti-position in the Democratic Party, and everybody knows this, and it's anti-Bush.
Okay.
Whoever gets the nomination, I'm going to send them money. I'm going to make phone calls, and I'm going to talk to people I know, and I'm going to send mass mailings on the email. We can disagree about whether or not that resolution was the right thing to do at the time. And some Democrats were there, same intelligence, voted against it. To me, that's a non-issue anymore. I mean, I think the party understands where they went wrong, those that supported it. They wanted to trust Bush. You should trust, the commander-in-chief, and they were lied to. The country was lied to. And that's the issue that's going to come back and bite Bush eventually, one of many.
Shell, is this a non-issue now for the Kucinich people?
I mean, it is a non-issue for the reasons that Larry suggested. That is, that we're all so adamantly determined to get Bush out of the White House, and will support any of the candidates who are in the race to do that. But I do think we have to continue to talk about the war and talk about not so much how people voted on the resolution, but where do we go now? And are we crafting a policy that's just a kind of reflection of a Bush doctrine that sees a long-term U.S. involvement? Or are we really talking about something else? Are we talking about getting out and getting somebody else in who can, and are we also, and the thing that I think Dennis continues to inject into the campaign is that we're talking about, in his view, if we're serious, getting rid of any our claims to the oil assets of Iraq, getting rid of this program of privatization, which is, in a sense, a kind of economic colonization that involves U.S. corporations, the U.S. government, in a long-term involvement in controlling the destiny of that country. I think that's an important debate for us to continue to have among Democrats, and for whoever the final nominee is, to be pushed by others to take a concrete position in favor of getting us out of there in a way that George Bush will never do.
Okay.
But Shell, a question I've got for you guys, and not that I think, you know, you've got the Kucinich answer, but a concern I've got. At what point, we know what happened last time. We supported the viability of a Kucinich group in Coralville because I thought it was so important, that passion, that energy. But at what point is he going to be able to say to his people, they are listening, if it's Kerry and Edwards, if it's Kerry, some combination of Clark, whatever happens in the next 3 weeks, at what point can he say, we're being heard, we have other avenues? And I'm very concerned that with all that passion and with such good ideas and such a passionate move to try to move what I think they would say is move the party back to the left. Mm-hmm. At what point do we stop pulling on the party to move it either direction and go, whoever it is, one of the two with somebody else? That's a concern I've got, that it go too long.
Yeah, I mean, Dennis has made an ironclad commitment that he's in this as a Democrat. He's not pulling his people out of this race at some point to run a third-party candidacy. This is not a Ralph Nader exercise. And I think everybody recognizes the danger of that. Even though he has strong support from Greens, I think that he has enough credibility with them in the end to be able to say, we have to defeat George Bush. And I'm prepared to support any of these candidates, any other candidate.
Right. Sue mentioned Wesley Clark. Next week is New Hampshire. Our two front runners, Edwards and Kerry, what's going to happen?
New Hampshire may not decide that much, except I think it's the biggest test is probably for Howard Dean, if he rebounds or not. Clark will be under somewhat of a test, but the real test, I think, is February 3rd when you go to South Carolina and Oklahoma and other places, because then questions become, you know, can John Edwards really carry the South? Can John Kerry carry the South? Will Howard Dean play in the South? And is Wesley Clark, how will his outline be filled in? How will he be defined? So New Hampshire is a bit of a holding pattern, as I see it. I don't think too much will be decided there, but the players will shift around a little.
Well, I think you get down to no more than 3 viable candidates after New Hampshire. And I'll be the first to say that if Dean doesn't win New Hampshire, I think he's no longer viable.
Seriously?
Seriously. And because the expectations were too high, he should win. You know, he's been there enough. He's a neighbor. He's ahead right now. What's interesting is the psychological effect of the Iowa vote on the Dean supporters in New Hampshire. Because if they start drifting away, then the question is, where do they go? Because they're not going to go away. Right. They're just going to go somewhere else. I don't think they're going to go to Kerry. I think there's some residual baggage there. Edwards, I don't see playing better than 3rd in New Hampshire. And I think that would be great for him if he got that high. Sure. Clark is the real wild card there, and I see a lot of Dean people being very comfortable going with Wesley Clark. And I'm comfortable with Clark. I mean, he's the best Republican Democrat we got.
What is he? We don't know.
He's got a great tax plan. We know that. He doesn't have the health plan that
Better than
percentage
Howard
had.
Dean's, I guess.
Oh, no,
also.
I thought that's the thing where Dean should have
Right.
softened up a little bit
Very
with the
much.
tax plan. But Clark's got the simplest plan to understand as far as taxes go, and it's had the most residents in the South, whereas anywhere else in New Hampshire, which has crossover voting. It's a real test for Clark how he does that. He's got to come in at least second. He's got to beat Kerry. And if he beats Kerry, then Kerry has to start over again in the South.
But we don't know anything about Wesley Clark.
And don't you think Kerry's going to have to start over in the South a little bit anyway? Whatever Kerry does coming out of New Hampshire, you know, he started down there, but hasn't really been down there. Clearly, it's not the most, you know, easiest fit. So he's going to have to start over anyway. I'm not sure that 3, you know, I really think you're going to bounce around with 4 for quite a little while, because there's just so many pieces at play with this. And I think that Clark may have some of those same struggles. That there are stylistic, when you're taking hits and you're not, you know, that humor, that Ronald Reagan comfortable humor. Nobody's got that like Bush. Nobody. He's all Mr. Self-deprecation. You know.
Well, let me ask each of you a question, because we've got 2 minutes left. Our county convention is March 13th. Where are we going to be on March 13th? Will it be over? Will we have a nominee? Or will it be down to how many? Just go right around.
Tell me when the Southern primaries are again.
February 3rd.
February the 3rd.
And there's some March 2nd.
It'll be settled by March 13th.
And who will it be?
I think it's going to be Clark.
All right. Michael, from the Kerry campaign.
I'm not sure it's going to be settled by then. I think it's going to continue to be messy.
Until when?
It might go a long time. I mean,
To the convention?
it might turn into who's going with who. Obviously, no one's going to say that they're accepting the vice presidency, but I think the party would be very interested in any number of combinations.
And who's going to be the winner at the convention?
I think it's going to be John Kerry as president and John Edwards as vice president.
All right, 1 minute left. Tom Carsner, is it going to be over by March 13th?
Yes, because by March 2nd or 3rd is California and New York.
Yeah.
And Edwards is everybody's second choice. Everybody likes John Edwards. I think John Edwards will be the biggest beneficiary of other candidates.
And
he'll win the South.
He'll be the nominee.
Yes, sir.
All right.
I think
Sue.
it'll be over, and it's going to be Kerry and Edwards as VP.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to be over. I think the debate is going to continue. It's going to be messy, but it's going to be messy in a good sense, because it's going to continue to get the anti-Bush message out in the public arena in a way that this debate has, it seems to me. The other one, quick thing, it seems to me one of the critical ingredients in this campaign, if not the most critical ingredient, is which candidate is going to be able to mobilize enthusiastically the black vote. Mm-hmm. That is absolutely crucial for the Democrats to get out in huge numbers. And I'm still looking for the candidate who's really speaking to the issues that confront African Americans. And that's
right.
going to be
Sharpton could easily come in second in South Carolina.
Do you think George Bush is worried on such a large turnout last night in Iowa that the Democratic Party is really, really
I don't know if he
red
knows
hot?
how to worry.
He ought to be. I'll tell you who's
Me
worried.
worrying?
He may not be worried, but Karl Rove was having a bad night last
The
night.
Democrat will win Iowa by more than 4,000 votes.
All
I
right. Well,
predict.
thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Gary.
Representative from each of the candidates. We hope to do this again a little bit later in the spring. Thank you very much for being with us on this special edition of Live and Local. Iowa Cityans look back at the caucus. Thank you very much.